Thanks for being here today. Today is our third session of our Trinity 101, and today we've talked about so far, what have we talked about so far? We've talked about, back up here. We've talked about the Christian gospel. That was the first session, and then the second session last week was the Christian way of life. And basically, the Christian gospel is, what does it mean when you talk about the gospel? What does that even mean? And we talked about that at length. And then the way of life is basically, now that you're a Christian, how do you live differently, or how do you strive to live differently? So we covered those two things the past 2 weeks, past two sessions rather. Today we're going to talk about our Anglican identity. And an Anglican is essentially the branch of the church where the Episcopal Church comes out of. We'll get to all that. This is definitely a survey, a very high-level survey of Anglicanism. We're going to do it all in less than an hour. I do have a 8-part series on the website that I recorded 8 or 9 years ago in a video. I look a lot younger then too. But it's an 8-week session called the Anglican 101, and it's basically a much deeper dive on Anglican history, the Church of England, all the kings and the debates and all that stuff. If you like that sort of thing, history and where theology develops, and really get it, if you come from either a Protestant background or like an evangelical background, that might really be helpful for you to kind of get a sense of where does Anglicanism come from, like with regards to like the Catholic Church and so forth, and the Orthodox Church. That's the Anglican 101. It's on the website. You'll find it if you Google. It's just a YouTube video. So check that out. We're going to do a flyover today when we talk about the our Anglican identity as part of this class. So one thing to actually realize, which is kind of a new thing for a lot of people that come to Christianity, let's see here, is the idea is, first of all, we're going to use the word Catholic a lot. That word Catholic is actually a really interesting word because it's both a noun and an adjective. And so it's the word katalikos in Greek, and it means people say universal. It's kind of, my opinion, a poor translation. It means like all-encompassing, which sounds clunky in English, but it's actually a closer idea. The idea of being a Catholic, essentially, is what is the fullness of the faith, both in time and space. So, for example, if you were to say, the word Catholic does not mean Roman Catholic, that's how people take it, we're going to get to that, but the idea of Catholic by itself just means universal. And the reason that's important is Anglicans consider ourselves to be Catholic in the sense of the sense that we believe what the Catholic faith has always believed. Don't think Roman. We're going to get to this in a little bit of detail, but more like what does the church always believe throughout time and history. So the idea of Catholic, people hear that and they get sort of freaked out by it. And there's nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing to kind of read into too much. There is definitely a break between the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. There's certainly a break there. But they all come from the same root. In fact, one thing to bear in mind, this might make the whole thing make a lot more sense to you, is that, we say in our Nicene Creed, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. You've said it every time you've been here. Well, what does that even mean? Because there's not only one church anymore, there's lots of different denominations, thousands of them. So what does that even mean? Well, the important thing to remember is that when the church was initially formed, up into the year 1054, we're going to get to that briefly, the church was only one. So, I don't want to draw on the board because you can't get it on camera, but the idea being, when the Nicene Creed says we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, there was at that period of time, in the year 362 or so, only one. Does that make sense? It was before the break. And so we're actually, as Anglicans, saying, even though we are, as Christians, fractured into all different flavors, we appeal to that identity as who we are really at our core. Does that make sense? So if that confuses you, again, the Anglican 101 class does a much deeper dive on all of this. But the idea for what I want you to take away from today, when you hear the word Catholic, is not to be freaked out. It doesn't mean Roman Catholic. That's a different thing. And in fact, some people would argue, and I would actually argue this, that if the word Catholic means universal, then to say Roman Catholic is kind of almost a contradiction in terms, right? You're using a specific thing to refer to a universal thing. Well, which are you? And so what we would argue is that the Roman Catholic Church is the Catholic Church based out of Rome, where you could almost say that the Anglican Communion is the English Catholic Church based historically in Canterbury. Make sense? So that's kind of the idea. And then there's also another whole branch of Christianity, which we're not going to talk about today at all, is the Eastern Orthodox, which are also from the very beginning of the foundation of Christianity. So when you hear the word Catholic, don't freak out. Just realize it doesn't mean necessarily Roman Catholic. Okay. So, idea of Catholic, what does that even mean? And then the idea is that the Catholic faith has been passed down from it was certainly in Jerusalem where our Lord was, right? That's actually the center. Jerusalem is the founding center of the Catholic Church, not Rome and not Canterbury. But then it spread. So it spread worldwide. Eventually it went to Rome. Rome, because of the governing structures, became really prominent in the early church. There were 7 main churches called patriarchates, which were the sort of focuses of the early church. Rome was one of them. The rest of them are all in the Eastern Church, actually, surprisingly. But as time went on, the church began to grow, and this Catholic faith spread. So eventually, you get to the point where the church actually based, the Pope, actually, or the Bishop of Rome, sent missionaries to England. They evangelized the heathen, literally, because these people were the people that lived in England before the migration of the Christians weren't exactly the kind of people you want to have for dinner. They were unpleasant rabble fellows, and the church went to England and converted them. And eventually what you have now is a church in England, right, and elsewhere too, all over the place, that began to have sort of a local flavor. And so when we talk about English Christianity, which we're going to see in a minute, it's got a sort of a distinctive flavor to it, meaning culture and practice, which we'll get to. Another important thing, and I'm going to move on, about this idea of Catholic. Talked about this last week a little bit. There's an idea in Catholicism and the idea of Catholic Christianity that the ordination is this idea of apostolic succession. Talked about this last week. And it's the idea that when you're ordained a bishop, a priest or a deacon, when you are ordained, the bishop, for example, for me as a priest, put his hands on my head and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit for the office and work of a priest. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. Whose sins you retain, they are retained. And be thou a faithful dispenser of his holy word and sacraments." That's the words, something like that. But the idea is the church always believed one of the marks of Catholicity, whether you're Roman Catholic, Anglican, or Orthodox, is that the transmission of holy orders was done tactily through the laying on of hands, literally. Like the Holy Spirit is I'll say transmitted, that's probably the wrong word, but transferred by the laying on of hands physically. That's a distinctive mark of what you might call a Catholic Christian. And that's still the case today. I actually have somewhere in my office a chart that shows the bishop that ordained me all the way back, literally all the way back to the original 12. And I forget which one of the original 12 apostles was the original bishop in that thread, but this is something which the church has always maintained, whether you're a Roman Catholic, Orthodox, or Anglican, for that matter. And that's an important mark of what you might say a Catholic Christian. Sometimes you'll see the word Catholic spelled with a little c, and in fact, in our own prayer book, on one of the Eucharistic liturgies, it's with a little c as a noun, as an adjective, universal, and in another prayer, it's with a capital C as a noun. So it's a both and. Okay. So what you see in England is this explosive growth, and you begin to see as the church always does when it goes into an area, it becomes part of the culture. Like you acclimate to the culture in which you're in, and so what you wind up seeing is what some people refer to as Celtic Christianity, which honestly nowadays is more of a projection or and we don't know a whole lot about it. We know it was a real thing. There's some things about the church in England that are unique and distinct from, say, the other parts of the Catholic Church. For example, I'll give you one. It comes to my mind immediately. If you've ever been here in Advent, right, which some of you have been here in Advent, you'll notice that the priests wear different colors of vestments throughout the year. In the Roman Church, they would wear in Advent a purple chasuble, which looks like it's basically a poncho. It's the thing that the celebrant wears over the top. In the Celtic Church, in the Church of England, they would wear blue. And it's actually technically more like a light purple than a blue. But the idea being, it's not a very important one, but it's a distinctive mark of the English church. This idea of having these blue vestments rather than purple, for example. So the idea here is that as the church expanded, it began to take on the cultures in which it moved. And then the church also began to take one of the different groups I have here, the Angles, the Saxons, all these different pagan groups, and begin to enculturate them into the life of the Christian faith. And I'm pretty sure this. Maybe you can correct me, Father, if you know for certain. We have liturgies that are actually from that period of time. Do we have them, or are they just sort of made up? I've never actually been able to get to the bottom of that question.
We at least have the medieval.
The medieval, right? Right, the medieval Celtic liturgy. So, yeah, and people like to project all sorts of kooky stuff into these things, to be honest with you. But we do know that the church had a distinctive flavor in England that it had in Rome. And so you begin to see this continued kind of development between the church of the Catholic faith and universal, right, in Rome, in the Orthodox Church in England, kind of developing, kind of doing their own thing, communicating with each other, in communion and fellowship with each other, but really kind of becoming more and more different. For example, if any of you come from Eastern Orthodox backgrounds, you know that those liturgies are really different from Western liturgies. The way their liturgical forms work, their prayers are very different. We all believe the same things, for the most part, minor theological differences. But in terms of the cultures, they actually, culturally, these things are, these different people groups have different ideas. Then you move along. So we're gonna jump really far ahead to the English Reformation. The Reformation is when the Protestants began to emerge in England in like the 16th century, so 1500s and so forth. The church in England began to break away from the Church of Rome, right? The Roman Catholic Church, if you know your history, began to, there's a lot of reasons for this, but the Pope began to assert political power, great political power, and great political and great wealth. And as a result of that, began to assume a sort of a monarchical view of the Bishop of Rome. And if you know your church history, in the year 1054, something occurred which we call the Great Schism. A schism is a split in the church. And in 1054 was sort of the first of several schisms in the church, but 1054 is called the Great Schism because in the Great Schism you had the church, which to that point had been one unified thing, break into two big halves, right? We call them now the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church. So basically Rome and everybody else. And they excommunicated each other, and there's a great big mess, and there's a lot to it. That was the first Great Schism. And one of the reasons for the Great Schism was, as you might guess, the Pope's claim of universal jurisdiction. So the way the bishops always worked, even though you had all these bishops around the world, the way they would work is something called collegially. So they would meet in what's called a synod, and they would discuss things, like the Council of Nicaea. We see the Nicene Creed. That was a group of hundreds of bishops that got together to hash questions through. And there were theological discussions, so sometimes, like church politics can get pretty ugly. If you know, there's an old saying, nothing like a church fight. Well, that's true, right? And so the church would duke it out amongst these bishops, but eventually Rome began to claim jurisdiction that they were sort of like the Bishop of Rome was somehow like the super bishop, but he was like the most important one. We could get along here, and so that began to take place, and then eventually you begin to see a split between Rome and the Church in England, and I want to talk about that for a second. We all know about Henry VIII. We've heard about him, King Henry VIII. So this is in the 15th century. Henry VIII, interestingly, was a devout Roman Catholic. He was given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope because he was a very conservative, staunch Roman Catholic and supporter of the traditional faith. But things get a little dicey because King Henry was the King of England. He needed an heir, and he couldn't get one. And you know the story, if you don't know all the specific details. But one thing to know, which you might not know, which most people don't know this, is Henry married a woman named Catherine of Aragon. You know that part, right? What you might not know is that Catherine of Aragon had been married to his brother Arthur, who had been the king. Arthur's dead, and so Henry marries Catherine of Aragon in his place, which is a little strange. I think we can all agree. You marry your dead brother's wife. Well, why would he do that? Well, in that period of time, marriages were frequently done for political alliances, right? Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of, wait for it, the King of Spain. So, what you find is Henry VIII, Arthur dies, Henry takes his wife Catherine to be his bride to maintain that alliance with Spain, to keep the Pope happy, because the Pope is currently under house arrest by the King of Spain. See how it gets nothing like a church fight. And so Henry, as you know the story, then tries to have children with Catherine of Aragon. She is unable to have children, and so what does he do? Everyone says, he wanted to divorce her, he's a scoundrel. Actually, no. What he actually appealed to the Bishop of Rome for was what's called an annulment. And what an annulment means is that you enter into a marriage contract, but the marriage is invalid because of some impediment. Make sense? So, for example, if you ever, well, none of you will probably get married by me, but if you ever were going to get married by me, and you're a husband and wife come to me to get married, I say to them, no drinking before the wedding. And I don't care what you do afterwards, but I don't want you coming into the wedding drinking, because if you're intoxicated, that's an impediment. It's not full consent. I want you to be able to give full consent. There are things which can cause a marriage to be invalid. One of them is, Henry was afraid that because he married his dead brother's wife, God had cursed him. He wouldn't give him any sons, and so therefore he appeals to the Bishop of Rome for an annulment. The Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope, says, I'm under house arrest by her dad, so the answer is no. See how this goes. And then Henry goes, well, wait a second. And again, at this period of time, again, it was a lot different than now. The king actually claimed and believed in something called the divine right of kings. The king was put in place by God, which actually is true. We all know. Even now, all political power is put in place by God, sometimes for our blessing, sometimes to teach us a lesson. That's a matter for the historians to decide. But the point is, Henry believed that he was functioning in this divine role as the military protector of Christendom in England. He believed it, and all monarchs did, frankly. So then he gets to thinking to himself, well, why am I appealing, if I'm the King of England and I'm protector of England, why am I appealing to the Bishop of Rome for an annulment? And it's a good question, right? It's like, why would you appeal, if you live in Florida, why would you appeal to the governor of Texas for a stay of execution, for example, right? So Henry says, you know what? I got an idea. I'm going to go to this guy named Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he says, hey, Thomas, I need an annulment because of X, Y, Z. He grants it. And as you know, everything begins to fall apart. The interesting thing to remember, and again, this is covered in detail in the Anglican 101, Henry eventually claims an annulment. He's granted an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. It gets messy from there, and Henry is kind of a scoundrel. But the idea being, that goes, then his daughter Mary retakes the throne, Bloody Mary. She kills all the people that try to split from Rome. And then she dies, and her sister Elizabeth comes to the throne. And she becomes the queen, and she is the one who makes the final break from Rome. Make sense? So the reason I'm telling you all this is your Roman Catholic friends will say, well, that's just a church started by Henry VIII who wanted a divorce. That's just not true. And what happened was Elizabeth eventually began to see the Church of England, the Church in England, the Catholic Church in England, as not under the authority of the Bishop of Rome, but under the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury as a local bishop, and that's where the split occurred. So the point being, if you look at the Church in England, which is what we come out of, the Church in England was not largely a theological reformation. The reformers in England, at least initially, were not really theologically trying to reform the church as much as they were trying to reform it from a political perspective. If you look at, on the continent, for example, you had the Presbyterians in Scotland. Well, that's not really the continent. But in Scotland, you have the Presbyterians. They had the Presbyterian movement was all about getting rid of clergy. The sacraments are not important. It's all about preaching scripture and so forth. On the continent, you had Lutherans. You had all sorts of different groups in the Protestant Reformation. Most of those reformers were actually theologically based. Make sense? They were trying to, some theological question they were trying to fight against. In England, that's just not the case. The English Reformation, for the most part, was focused around political autonomy of England from Rome. That's an important thing because people will walk in here and they'll sometimes say, this is a Protestant church, it seems very Roman Catholic. Well, because it's kind of both, right? You're Protestant in the sense that you're not under the Bishop of Rome, you're not Roman Catholic, but we are still Catholic, meaning we maintain the same faith structure that the Roman Catholic Church would have had. Make sense, everybody? So that's an important detail. Anglicans are unique, actually, in this. As far as all the groups that broke during the Reformation that were formed, the Anglican Church is actually unique in that regard. So that's a very high level view of the Reformation. And the idea is the Pope began to assert political power, and the Pope said he had the authority to create new bishops, right? The Pope, even now, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, appoints all the bishops in the Roman Catholic Communion. If you want a Bishop of Toledo, Ohio, guess who makes the Bishop of Toledo, who decides who that person is? The Bishop of Rome. You want to decide who the Bishop of West Palm Beach is? Who decides that? The Bishop of Rome. Why is that? You know, in our own polity, in the Episcopal Church, the way our bishops are selected they are elected by the people in the diocese. I was the chair of the search committee for our bishop now. I ran that committee. And what we do is that man is elected, or woman for that matter, could be elected bishop and then is consecrated bishop by the bishops in the church, in the Anglican church that they live in. So it's a lot different. The Roman Catholic Church is, if you grew up Roman, you know this, extremely top down. Top down meaning like Pope down. And then the Anglicans tend to be a lot more flat, you might say, like less structured hierarchically. And interestingly enough, you would think that the Henry VIII would have been excommunicated by the Pope. He wasn't. It wasn't until Elizabeth I, she was finally excommunicated by the Pope, and the Pope said to all of his Roman Catholic subjects living in England, which there were many, you're no longer under her authority, you are no longer bound to be under her authority as her subjects, which is kind of, I don't know, kind of mean, I suppose you'd say. But they are absolved from civil allegiance to her. Why would you do that? Well, to cause a revolution and to upset the apple cart in England, which they tried to do. Again, I'm giving it a very high level. Anglican 101 covers this in more detail. So the idea here is the big thing, the big takeaway in all this is just to realize that the Anglican Communion or the Anglican Church started off more of a political break with Rome than actually a theological one. And you see that even now. There's a lot of similarities between Rome and the Anglican Church. The Roman Catholic Church has since gone on to create new things, like that the Pope is infallible, like that Mary was a perpetual was born without original sin, the Immaculate Conception. Those are doctrines taught by the Roman Catholic Church, which the Roman Catholic Church says you must believe to be saved. Most Romans don't know that. Most Romans would say, I know a lot of them said to me, well, I'm a Roman Catholic, but I don't really believe in the Pope. And I say, welcome to the Episcopal Church, you know? Because those if you do not believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary, in the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and in the infallibility of the Pope, you are not saved. It's not you're just a bad Roman Catholic. You're not saved. And most Roman Catholics don't know that. Those were developments that occurred after the break between the Church of England and the Church of Rome. So that is one theological difference now between us and them. Some people, I know Anglicans that believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. Was she always a virgin? I don't know. Maybe. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But what I wouldn't say to you as an Anglican is that you have to believe it to be saved. Make sense? It's a little different. Okay. So some people would actually refer to Anglicanism, and I like this actually. I'm not sure who came up with it, but I remember reading it somewhere and thought it was a clever way to say it. Somebody referred to Anglicanism as primitive Catholicism. And this should actually read, I got to fix this. This should actually read, without Roman accretions, Roman additions, like the perpetual virginity of Mary or the infallibility of the Pope. Primitive Catholicism without Roman accretions or Protestant subtractions. The Protestants would, most Protestants, particularly the Presbyterians and so forth, would get rid of the entire sacramental system, get rid of the priesthood, get rid of apostolic succession, all those things. They got rid of the whole, threw the baby out with the bathwater, you might say. We would say those are Protestant subtractions. Roman accretions would be things that are added that Rome now teaches that we don't believe in. So if someone asks you if you're a Catholic, you tell them you're a primitive Catholic. How's that sound? And they won't know what you mean, but that's okay. All right, let's move along. So the important things to remember, what is the net of all this? Well, in the Reformation in England, what you see is that the Church of England maintained the traditional historical Catholic view of holy orders, of bishops, priests, and deacons, even today. So if you go anywhere in the world as an Anglican and you receive communion from an Anglican priest, you will receive communion from a priest who was ordained in apostolic succession. Anywhere you go. That is still the case. It's a non-negotiable. We have a calendar, sacraments. These are all kind of inherited from the Roman Catholic Church to a degree. One thing which was also a big change, which many of you know this, is that in the Anglican Church, the Anglican Communion, their priests can marry. I'm a married man. My other two clergy here are married men. In the Roman Catholic Church, of course, that's not the case. Unless, there's always exceptions, if you were an Episcopal priest and you leave the Episcopal Church and become a Roman Catholic and you've got a wife and a couple kids, well, you can't divorce. So, well, okay, you can then bring your wife. I know I've got friends of mine that have done this, that were Anglican priests, became Roman Catholic priests, kept the wife and kids. So there are married Roman Catholic priests, but just not very many of them. And one more thing you should be aware of is something called, I talk about this a lot actually. Does this thing work? Oops. The branch theory of the church. The branch theory of the church. One thing to remember is if you look at, I talk about the Catholic Church, right? We talk about the Roman Catholics, we talk about the Orthodox, and we talk about Anglicans. Anglicans have a unique theology of the church. It's called ecclesiology, is the fancy word. And it goes like this. We refer to it as the branch theory, and that is that there are three main branches of the church. There's the Roman Catholic branch, there's the Orthodox branch, and there is the Anglican branch. Those are the three main branches of the Catholic faith. That's our theology of how that works. So the Roman Catholics don't believe that. They believe they're the only ones. The Orthodox don't believe that. They believe they're the only ones. We would say we're not the only ones, but we're part of the only ones. Does that make sense? Okay. The branch theory of the church. It's an important theological idea. A couple things to be aware of too. In the Church of England, because it was birthed in the Reformation, you have varying degrees of what you might call churchmanship. Churchmanship is really just more or less liturgical style. So if you come to church here, for example, you know that Trinity Church is what you might call high church, right? We use incense, we ring bells, we chant a lot of the liturgy, we do eastward-facing Mass, which is very traditional. So not all Episcopal churches, not all Anglican churches are like that. There's different sort of threads. There's the high church variety. There is the evangelical variety. My seminary that I went to was an evangelical seminary. Still believe the same things. So you still use the prayer book. You still believe in the same sacraments. You still believe in apostolic succession. Just the liturgy is a lot simpler. Broad church are more of sort of middle of the road. And then this idea of the charismatic, which is bringing the Holy Spirit into all three of those streams. So you can find someone who's a charismatic high churchman, charismatic low churchman, that sort of thing. Has anybody ever been to a low church parish or a broad church parish before? You probably have, yeah. If you ever go to Virginia or South Carolina, Virginia there are tons of Episcopal churches in Virginia because, if you don't know this, when Virginia was founded as a colony, it was founded as an Anglican colony. So the Church of England was the official religion of Virginia. You know that? So there are Anglican churches. You can't swing a cat without hitting an Anglican church in Virginia. You ever been to Old Williamsburg? Anybody? Colonial Williamsburg. It's awesome. If you've never been there, it's super cool. There's a church there called Bruton Parish. It's an old Church of England parish founded before the Revolutionary War. and it is definitely low church, but still quite beautiful. All right, so as time went on, so the Church of England has become separate from Rome. If you know anything about your history, the British became very powerful, and they're seafaring, and so they began, we have what emerges in about the 18th century, 19th century, what's known as the British Empire. You've heard of that before, right? The British Empire begins to expand, pretty much takes over the world, right? Including us. The British Empire was, the United States was a British colony, America was. So as the British went out in the 18th and 19th centuries and basically traded and colonized different parts of the world, they brought the Church of England with them. And so you can go, if you go to Philadelphia, for example, you go to Christ Church, Philadelphia, it was a church where was founded as a Church of England parish. And it's where George Washington worshiped, right? And lots of places that. Here's an interesting story. If you know anything, you guys have heard of Wall Street in New York, right? You've heard of Wall Street? Of course. There's a lot of money on Wall Street. There's a lot of very tall buildings and very large buildings on Wall Street. If you walk along Wall Street, you'll find a little church called Trinity Church, Wall Street. I've never actually been, but I've seen pictures of it. It's not very big. Trinity Church, Wall Street was given by the Queen of England. It's an Anglican church, Church of England parish. There, Trinity Church, Wall Street owns all the property on Wall Street, and all those buildings there are leased to Trinity Church. It is the wealthiest church in all Christendom. So, case in point. Yeah, not much, well, that's all I'm going to say. This is on tape. So anyway, the point being, as the Church of England, as the communion or the empire spread, they brought the Church of England with them, and these churches began to become autonomous, meaning independent from England. I'll give you an example. In the United States, the Anglican Church is called the Episcopal Church. And the obvious question is, well, Father, why is it not the Anglican Church of the U.S.? There's a good answer for that. The reason being, the American Church was separate from the Church of England after the Revolutionary War. We had a war with these people, right? As to be a bishop in the English Church, you had to swear fealty to the King. He's the head of the Church of England. Well, wait a minute. You're an American bishop serving the state of New York. I can't swear an oath of loyalty to the King. What do we do? So what they did is they actually went, if you don't know this, that the American church actually got their apostolic succession from the Church of Scotland, which is also Anglican, but that way it didn't require the bishops to swear an oath of loyalty to the church, to the King of England. So it's a little complicated, but the idea is as these churches went out and spread, they began to form into autonomous groups. And now what you have are independent churches, meaning just like the Church of England was not under the Church of Rome, right? The Church of the American Episcopal Church is not under the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but we are all in communion with each other. It's kind of like a family. So think of it almost like state governments, right? You know, Florida and South Carolina, we're not under the governance of this governor of South Carolina, but the governor of Florida, DeSantis, and the governor of South Carolina, whoever that is, I'm sure they have some sort of a familiar, well, certainly a collegial relationship, right? That's sort of the way the church works now, that we're not, the churches are all these sort of collegial, these national churches, whether it's the Anglican Church of Canada, the Church of England, the Anglican Church of Ireland, the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church of Japan, which interestingly, the Church of Japan is called the Holy Catholic Church of Japan. That's the Anglican Church there. They're all in communion with each other. You can share clergy amongst them. They all believe the same things based out of the Book of Common Prayer, but they're independent from each other. They're not under there's no pope, right? And if you know anything about the Orthodox Church, they work the same way. The Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Ethiopian Orthodox are all in communion with each other, but there's no pope. They have a guy called the Ecumenical Patriarch, who's kind of the dad that oversees it, sort of like the President of the United States, kind of like doesn't have any real authority except to draw Congress together. These different patriarchs have the idea of drawing people together. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, in our polity, his job is to bring all the bishops of the Anglican Communion together once every 10 years, and they decide on issues. They decide on things. So his role is really more of a calling together of all the different bishops rather than being a pope. So that's how that works. Now, today there are in the Anglican Communion more than 80 million members of the Anglican Communion. It is the third largest church in the world. The average Anglican right now is not an old white guy, but a young black woman. If most of the Anglicans now, if you know anything about England, when they colonized the world, they had a lot of colonies in Africa, tons of it. And so the typical Anglican today is an African. And if you know anything, so there's been a lot of, the Episcopal Church in this country has gone, in some cases, very, very liberal. And of course, the churches of Africa are very, very conservative, and that creates a lot of tension within the communion. But be that as it may, certainly the growth and sort of the norm of the church of the Anglican Communion is in the South, whether it's in Southeast Asia, which is actually quite large as well. Singapore has a huge Anglican component to it. Also, Africa and South America have a lot of Anglicans in them. And the idea here is that the Archbishop of Canterbury sort of is like oversees it as a historic figure. He's sort of a figurehead that binds it all together, but he's not a pope. He doesn't have authority. He doesn't appoint bishops, for example, in different jurisdictions outside of the Church of England. And if you don't know, right now we are without an Archbishop of Canterbury because Justin Welby had to resign for a variety of reasons, but another will take his place, God being our helper. One more thing too to know, just as it's a funny word, and only a church person would make up this word and not think it's weird, is this idea of a primate. And a primate is whenever you have a national church, the head bishop of that church is called a primate. Prime meaning first, right? So if you know, on Sunday mornings we would pray for Michael Curry, our presiding bishop. He's retired, and so our new presiding bishop is named Sean Rowe, Bishop Rowe. I've never met him. Younger than me, actually. He's a young guy. But he is now our primate, and there are 38 of them. Each church in the Anglican Communion has a primate, a head person that is in charge of that jurisdiction. And one more thing, too, and I'm making note of this, too. One thing which is happening, right, you're seeing, it might not happen in your lifetime or in my lifetime, but we're actually seeing in the Anglican Communion is a move towards a conciliar model. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got these 38 primates. Each one of them runs a national church, right? The Church of Nigeria, Church of the American Church. And what you're seeing is that these heads of these churches are becoming more, you're seeing the governing structure of the Anglican Communion emerge into what's called a conciliar structure. So these different primates, when they're going to make a decision about something big, like women's ordination or whatever the issue might be, it could be anything, they would come together as a conciliar model to vote on these things and make these decisions. Up until now, it's been like church just does whatever it wants. Each church does whatever it wants, and it's caused a lot of tension in the communion for sure. But you're seeing this happening slowly. You're seeing this happen in the Anglican Communion, where these becoming more collaborative and more conciliar, meaning these bishops are working together as a council rather than sort of independent jurisdictions. If you don't know this, early in the 20th century, there was a huge movement towards reconciliation between the Anglicans, the Roman Catholics, and the Orthodox. And it really kind of fell apart in the mid-70s. The Episcopal Church decided to start to ordain women. It's actually against the church canons at the time. There was a group of 9 or 11 of them in Philadelphia that the Bishop of Philadelphia, ordained against the canons, the church laws, and that kind of blew the wheels off the whole thing. But there was a period of time in the 1980s, I guess it was, wasn't it, Father? 1976, 75, right in there, where we were a hair's breadth with being reunited with Rome, which would have been cool, I think, in terms of the body of Christ. And then that kind of blew up, and hopefully will come back at some point. But you did see that was a potential. Michael Ramsey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, I don't know, 5 or 6 removed, he was a very fine, and probably most recently my favorite Archbishop of Canterbury. He met with the Pope. It was Pope Leo the Sixth? Can't recall. He met with the Pope in England and gave the Pope his episcopal ring. The episkopos means bishop, right? So the Bishop of Rome gave the Archbishop of Canterbury his ring, which is a symbol of his office. You wear it on your right hand. It's a big old ring. And he put it on his hand and he said, brother. And everyone's like, what just happened? So, I mean, it was really close, and then it blew up. And hopefully, by God's grace, we can have some sort of reestablished communion with the Roman Catholic Church. We'll see. One more thing to be reminded of, when we talk about the Episcopal Church becoming in partnership with other denominations, back in the, I guess, 1980s, maybe it was earlier than that, they came up with something called the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, which just means 4 lines, right? And these are the if we're going to become in communion with another branch of Christendom, these are the 4 non-negotiables, and you can see them right there. So if the Church of England or the Episcopal Church was going to get back together with Rome, for example, or whomever, these are the 4 criteria by which that unification would be measured. We believe that the Holy Scripture contains all things necessary to salvation, right? So if it's not in Scripture, everything you need to know is in Scripture. You don't need a pope. You don't need any of that stuff. It's all in the Bible. The creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, are sufficient statements of faith. That's actually an important thing. If you come from an evangelical background or another Protestant denomination, they sometimes have confessions, like Luther's Catechism, for example. Those are their own sort of statements of faith. Anglicans don't have one of those. We say our statement of faith is the Nicene Creed. That's why we use it every Sunday. And the reason we say it's our statement of faith is because it's from all the way in 325 when the church was still one big church, right? We're Catholics, after all. We don't have our own statement of faith. We believe in what the church has always believed. So that's an important thing to know, that sometimes people will say sometimes, what's your statement of faith? The Nicene Creed, frankly. There are 2 sacraments, well, there's 7 sacraments, talked about that last week, but 2 of them given by Jesus, dominical is what that means. And these are required for salvation, baptism and the Eucharist, and then the historic episcopate, apostolic succession of bishops, adapted locally. Those are the 4 non-negotiables for reunion between an Anglican church and another denomination. Couple questions, a couple things here. I think we can kind of skip over this. If you are curious about, so if you don't know this is probably worth mentioning in passing, more detail in the Anglican 101. I spent quite a bit of time on this there. Back in when the Church of England was beginning to really explode and take over and really grow quickly, the Pope was like, we got to do something about this. And it was like 1896, I think it was. He declared this document called Apostolicae Curiae, which is a papal encyclical letter, which said that Anglican orders are invalid. They are fake. That's what the Pope said. Now, bear in mind, this is 300 years after the split occurred with Henry VIII, right? But there's a lot of political stuff that goes around this. What's worth knowing, and most people don't know this, is the Anglican bishops responded to that with this letter called Suppacius Officio. And the gist of it is this: the arguments that Rome makes for why Anglican orders are invalid, the Anglicans were like, wait a second, you guys did the same thing, and if we're invalid, then so are you. I'm making it simple, it's a lot more complicated than that. But the gist of it is, what the Anglicans pointed out, Anglican bishops pointed out, like, wait a second, if you're going to say our orders are invalid because of these things, well, if you go back here historically, you guys did the same thing. So you're also invalid. And of course, that's where it lays. I do think this might happen in my lifetime, that this will be overturned. This has come really close, where the Pope, where Rome has said, you know what, we made a mistake. The Roman orders are valid. That may happen. As it stands currently, that's not the case. There's also with Rome and reunion with Rome or the Orthodox, holy orders, women in the priesthood is a biggie. Roman Catholics and Orthodox do not ordain women to the priesthood or the diaconate. And then who has the authority to make changes? Is it the local bishop? Is it the Pope? That's the question. So this is pretty much what I want to talk about today. You'll also hear something called the Anglican Via Media, which means the middle way. And a lot of times people will say that just means that Anglicans are kind of wishy-washy. That's not actually true. The via media, the middle way, means that we are not fully Roman Catholic and not Protestant, sort of the middle of the road. It doesn't mean wishy-washy. It just means, like I said before, primitive Catholic, right, without Roman accretions or Protestant subtractions. We as Anglicans, like the Orthodox actually, frankly, strive to be as the church was in the first 10 centuries of its existence. And so one of the things we always appeal to as Anglicans is the tradition of the church, meaning the first centuries of the church. How did the church do it? And that's our operating principle for authority. The Roman Catholics, by contrast, would say, what does the Pope say? We would say, what has the church always said? And that's how we solve things. And so the via media means we're trying to be between Protestantism, which says it's your own decision, it's just you and Jesus. The Romans, which say it's the Pope, we'd say, yeah, there's a better way, which is let's appeal to what the church has always believed. So that's pretty much what I've got, I think. Anything else I want to talk about? I don't think so. So hope you enjoyed that. There's your Anglicanism. Again, if you are curious about, you want more information, 8 weeks on the website, Anglican 101. That's your go-to place for that. So if there's any questions, I can take them and we'll cut the tape.